All right. Hello, hello.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good day to everyone who's watching now or later for the replay. Today is Thursday.
Yep, we keep switching it up on you a little bit.
That's right. Summer schedule.
Yeah.
So how are you doing today?
We're actually still trying to experiment with what days are best for people. Chances are we'll just continue to rotate.
Yeah, unless you let us know.
Yes.
If you'd like to let us know if there's a time and day that works really well for you, provided that we're up and we're not asleep.
We do mornings.
Yeah. Time. But I'm just talking about like the time difference.
Time
zone difference. If it's conducive to many people's schedules, including our own, then we'd be happy to try out a different time and day, right?
I like to switch it up because that way everyone has different schedules.
That's true. That's a good point.
Spread the love. But
but we do put out two videos a week.
Yeah.
One being the live stream lesson and discussion, and then the other being the strategy lesson that we have. And they're both related, so that's really cool.
Yeah, well, to answer your question, I'm doing very well. And I'm excited for today's topic. Maybe you could introduce it?
Yes. Well, I just want to say hello. I think Vern is on. Hello, Vern.
Vern, hello.
Thank you for joining us.
Yes.
What the topic, right?
Yes.
So today's topic is apologizing, how to say sorry, what's an effective apology, how do you apologize to someone, essentially.
Right.
So how do you make amends? How do we find a way of repairing something in that friendship or relationship or whatever it is by saying sorry?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough, right? Apologies, first of all, for me, I find apologies challenging because it feels like a concession, right? Like I'm admitting wrongdoing. And so by apologizing, it's almost like I've lost the argument or I'm showing weakness, right? So I've always struggled with apologies for that reason. Because, that sense of indignation is firing in the back of my head, like, do I want to apologize? Did I really do something wrong here, or was it them?
Right.
So I find apologies very, very challenging. I think you've always been much better with them. I think you're much more able to release an apology, if that's the right verb, than I am.
My view is that, so we got a comment earlier this week on the lesson about, how an apology can be perceived. Right. And a lot of times it can be perceived as a weakness, as being vulnerable, showing vulnerability. But I like to take the other approach, which is I feel like it's a strength. If you're able to push your ego aside for a minute and take the reins and say, you know what, we're both at fault here, but I'm coming right now to you and saying I'm sorry. Then I think, so that's the way I see it. I see it more as a way of because you can look at it as a strength or you can look at it as a weakness. And I think there's validity in looking at it as both.
Sure.
But in that moment, I think it's important to say, you know what, let me be the bigger person and step up here with it.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean,
but it's hard, right?
People who apologize are people who are, it's like you're saying, whether or not it's admitting wrong, maybe in some cases you did, you were in the wrong, in other cases you weren't, or it's just not clear. Most cases it's just not clear. Most cases both parties have some fault.
The onus is on both people or all the people involved, right?
But for the person to apologize, at least the most successful apologizers, they're essentially putting all of that aside, right?
Right.
You transcend this deliberation as to who was the wrongdoer. You transcend that and you instead say, my objective here is actually to bring resolution to the situation. And so proving who's right or wrong, at least at this moment, is not going to bring about resolution. And so an apology basically says, I'm past that, and instead I want to, restore harmony so that we can sort of continue whatever it is we are doing, continue with our lives.
Exactly. And if you, put that up front and get it out of the way, then the rest of the conversation can be focused on resolving, on resolution, on,
next steps.
The next steps, or just go back to what you were doing before things got heated, right? That kind of thing. But I think, getting it out of the way sometimes is the best thing. I think most of the time it is, because otherwise things just drag on for maybe a couple hours, maybe a couple days, maybe for some people even a couple years, right?
yeah.
You hear people holding grudges against one another for years.
You think about the clans, right?
Oh, yeah,
Certainly in
from-
Europe,
yeah.
I'm sure in North America, anywhere there were tribes and
We just finished Outlander, so
Outlander.
there was
yeah,
a
yeah.
lot of that.
A lot of clans in Outlander. It was this period of it was staged in like just
American
before the American
Revolution.
Revolution.
Yeah.
And different family factions were sort of warring against each other. And yeah, you just like the grudges get held and held and held.
For generations.
For generations.
So you basically
Yeah.
bequeath that
Yeah.
to the generations
And people
to
even
come.
forget what they're angry about, but
Yeah.
they're angry, and they
Exactly.
know they're not, supposed to be angry, and
Right.
so yeah, no, I agree. The quicker you can get to
Yeah.
an apology, the quicker you can get to the problem solving, which is the fun part,
Yeah.
and also the less damage is done. I
That's
think
true.
one of
Yeah.
the things I've learned in conflict is the longer you leave the wound open and festering, the worse it gets, right?
Yeah.
The more infected it gets, the
Yeah.
more
Ugh.
swollen and
then you
inflamed
have
it gets.
to
Not to be too
really-
graphic here,
yeah,
but
yeah.
the point is, when you don't, like, an apology is kind of like suturing the wound, right? Sealing it and putting a Band-Aid on it.
Yeah, some Neosporin.
Some Neosporin, it begins, it at least lays the groundwork for repairing, right?
Yeah.
And I said you put a Band-Aid, that's sometimes used in other ways where it's like a temporary fix.
Right.
That's not my intention here. My intention here is to say that by apologizing, you essentially lay the groundwork for repair. And so the sooner you can do that, the less damage you need to repair.
Yeah, the less time the wound is open and festering, right?
Right.
So that's a good analogy, I think.
Yeah.
A little bit graphic, but that's okay. It's okay.
We like to be explicit.
You know,
Descriptive language. We're all
descriptive,
about
yeah.
communication.
All 5 senses involved
Yeah.
here. Yeah. So the fast double sorry method was something that we picked up from the book Option B, the book co-written by Sheryl Sandberg.
You did. I didn't read it.
And
You've been
Collective We.
You've been reading a lot of books. I've been very impressed.
So one of our friends got me, my brother also mentioned it, which was fun. So I have to give him credit too, about
He reads a lot as well.
the library apps. Yeah, he does. The library apps where you can essentially rent these audiobooks from the library.
Right.
So I have like 4 books going at once, usually 2 on my Kindle, 2 on my audiobook. Anyway, I digress. But the point is, from that book, Option B, one of the techniques that they discuss is the fast double sorry method. And that's essentially what we were talking about in terms of, getting it over with quickly.
Right.
Apologizing before things get even more heated. Because if they've gotten to a point where you feel the need to say sorry, or you're expecting the other person to say sorry to you, right? Then it's already gotten to a point where it's heated, right?
Totally.
But if we don't immediately address the situation, say sorry, then it just gets out of control, and then it turns into something else, and then you have a conflict about something else that wasn't the original conflict that started everything. So it's like all this mess that sort of ensues and compounds. And so that's what you do with the fast double sorry. You both say, all the participants, let's say in this case there are 2, both say sorry, and then it just feels like a huge load is lifted off, right?
Yeah, what I really like about that method is that it makes it almost mechanical.
Yeah.
Right? And again, for someone like me, I get very into the sort of the justice of the situation, unnecessarily so, particularly since most of the time they're minor situations. By making it mechanical, you bypass all that sort of cognitive dissonance around who's right or wrong.
Right.
It's like, this is just what you do.
It's the protocol.
It's a protocol.
Yeah.
And you initiate it very rapidly. And by doing that, it kind of cuts short. It short circuits that negative spiral in psychology, and again puts you on the path of making repairs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's one thing that you can try. There's a quote from this 1970s cult movie. That's before our time, but still, it's a cult, so it lasts. And it's called Love Story. It's based on a book, and then it turned into this movie.
I don't think I've seen it.
I don't think you've seen it either. I think I saw it once, but anyway. there's a line in there in the book, and then they also mention it in the film. Love means never having to say you're sorry. So that's a tricky one, right? It's kind of like a mind bender. I want to unpack that.
Yeah. Love means never having to say sorry.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
So what does that mean?
My interpretation of that is because your love is so strong, your relationship and understanding of the other person is so strong. You know that no harm was intended.
Exactly.
Right. You know that regardless of what just transpired, tempers and so forth, the dispute you might have had, the disagreement, none of that really matters in the larger context of the relationship.
Yeah.
And so an apology is almost superfluous because there's nothing to apologize for. You still love each other.
Yeah.
Nothing's changed about your relationship. You just had a spat, which every human has. That's kind of like how I interpret that.
Yeah. I also interpret it, so that's one interpretation. I also can see it being interpreted as if people love each other, and this doesn't have to be a romantic relationship. It could be a friendship. It could be a sibling relationship, parental and child, whatever. Love, right? If people love each other, then they don't do anything that will force them or result in they having to say sorry. Of course, now that's like a very tricky interpretation of it because we hurt people. People hurt us, right? When we're in these relationships, whether we meant to or not. Most of the time, we don't mean to, right? Unless you're a masochist.
Or a sadist.
But anyway, so most of the time, that's not the situation. And so that could be an interpretation, but I feel like that's almost a moot point because it ends up happening, right? Just life happens and, you might say something in haste and you didn't mean it and it just sort of like came out of your mouth and you shouldn't have said that, but that you did, and you know what I mean? And
that's a big part of it, right?
It could be a big part of
it. A lot of these things, anger does funny things to us, and frustration and
the temper,
sense, right? When you feel like you've been wronged, and we behave in ways that are very
irrational,
primordial.
Maybe? Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah, totally. Like banging our chest.
Yeah, exactly.
Tarzan.
Ways that don't really fit into modern society. They don't fit into the concept of a healthy relationship.
Right.
We do them, but they're part of our sort of old school programming.
Yeah, it's old software.
That there are all kinds of thought practices to start to work past that kind of reaction. But it happens.
Yeah, it
happens.
Yeah.
And I think going back to that phrase, I think
love means never having to say you're sorry.
Right.
I just want to repeat it.
It's basically saying we know that happens. We know we act out in ways that we don't mean to, that we don't mean in the long term, that we just do in the moment.
Yeah.
And it recognizes that and it says doesn't change the bigger picture.
Exactly.
That said, that phrase doesn't, to me, mean you shouldn't apologize.
Totally.
I think it's just more at a higher level. If you step back and, a day later, a week later, a year later, when you look back at it, you know that nothing changed there, that you guys, you still have that strong relationship, but simply in the moment, you lost yourselves.
Yeah, and go ahead. What were you doing?
I was just saying, nonetheless, the apology in that moment is still critical. And it coming from both sides too, right?
It's so important.
Is critical because that's again what helps seal the wound and start the healing process in that moment.
Yeah. So and one way to look at it too is not have these conflicts and points of tension and things like that, because the relationship, in order for it to become strong and healthy, stronger and healthier, you do need to have that friction, right? But the point is to not let it fester, you address it, right?
Yeah.
So it's that sorry part is very important, right? It's not like you can overlook that and think, in a few days this will blow over, we'll forget about it, and we'll pick up where we left off. Well, you could do that, but then you run the risk of, going through the motions of a healthy looking friendship or relationship, and then one day it just, crumbles, and it doesn't seem like there was any rhyme or reason for that, but it does. And then it's like, well, what happened? Well, what happens is sometimes, when you don't address, a lot of times when you don't address the little bouts of conflict or this and that and the other, disagreements, diverging viewpoints, whatever you want to call it, if you don't say sorry and you don't address it and you don't have that, makeup moment and the conflict resolution,
Right.
then it's sort of like, what's the point of having this friendship or relationship, or, unless you're going to, give yourself to it and sort of like let it grow and let it become stronger, like watering a plant, right? You need to say sorry to it. Right, so that's another way of
saying
looking
sorry
at it.
like watering a plant. Yeah, you're right. Sorry can be one of these things that's just like watering a plant, or I'm thinking of replenishing the soil in a pot.
Oh, that's a good analogy. I like that.
To maintain
Yeah,
that, right?
yeah.
You're
Nurturing it.
You're nurturing. Yeah. Whatever it is, you're nurturing the relationship. The sorries are a nurturing aspect. Now, you bring up an interesting point, which is, in your case, it was just not saying sorry ever, right? But
In that example?
yeah, in that example.
Yeah, I think so some people deal with conflict by just ignoring it and pretending
exactly.
like it didn't happen, and no need to say sorry and no need to resolve the conflict. So that's one way. But then don't be surprised if all of a sudden it all shatters.
Yes.
The other way is to attack that issue right off the bat, or give it maybe a day or two, whatever, but more
So that's what I want to get at.
quickly. Yeah, let's talk about that part.
Okay, so the question is, and what I'm focusing on right now is that period between when you have the conflict and when you say sorry. So we've been saying get to that sorry as fast as possible.
Yeah, if you can.
Sometimes that's difficult,
That's
right?
true.
Sometimes in the moment it's so heated that you do benefit from a break.
Yeah.
Right?
Like a timeout. Take a timeout.
And the intention isn't to, take that break and then forget that it ever happened. The break is simply to let our,
Nerves
bodies
cool.
return to equilibrium, and then work on the apologies and then work on the repairs.
Yeah.
My point simply is that it can sometimes be helpful, if you're not able, if it's really a heated situation.
Right. Or a very difficult,
yeah.
Type of situation.
Yeah.
That is more than, it goes beyond just saying sorry and making up.
Sometimes a little space and distance for a short period of time can go a long way.
Yeah.
Half an hour, even a day in some cases.
Yeah.
Can go a very long way.
Yeah.
Like you can go out, maybe go for a run,
Yeah.
do
Clear
some
your
exercise.
head. Yeah.
And then come back to the situation with a much clearer head.
Yeah. I think that's true, to differentiate between the types of, conflicting situations that would require ultimately a sorry. But the point is it still gets addressed, because that's how you strengthen the foundations of friendships and relationships and that kind of thing.
And those kinds of conflicts, those intense, serious conflicts, aren't as common, right? I mean, the reality is most of the stuff we squabble about tend to be silly little things. They don't require deep introspection and thought, right? A lot of it just has to do, frankly, with stuff that's not even relevant to what you're fighting about.
Yeah.
It could be because you're frustrated about something else. It could be something at work, or
exactly. Maybe
your car didn't start.
Right,
who knows?
right. You missed the subway and you took it out on your best friend later that day, and your best friend had nothing to do with the subway running late or whatever.
Exactly.
Right?
And so in those situations, I think those are much more common. And that's why
the fast double sorry.
That's why the fast double sorry is great, because more often than not, it can be resolved with just an immediate apology from both sides. And actually, that brings up one of the things that I thought was really important to emphasize from that video, which is, and we touched on this, but both sides need to be apologizing, right? It takes both sides, which means you need to have a discussion about this method ahead of time, right?
Yeah.
You can't expect someone to immediately, if you say sorry, you can't expect them to immediately say sorry. You might catch them off guard, and that could help. But the best way for this to work is to have a conversation with someone and say, whoever it is you spend a lot of time with, and say, here's a cool new method that I think could work. What do you think?
Thoughts?
Yeah, what do you
how
think
can
about
we
this?
incorporate this into our friendship? Hello, Hanze, I think. I can't really read from here, but hello, whoever just joined.
Yeah.
Welcome.
But right, so I think by priming the person that you're spending time with and who you want to use this with, priming them ahead of time is really the only way to get this to work.
Yeah.
Because without knowing about it, the other person is unlikely to come back with a sorry off the bat.
That's true. And they might find it like that you're maybe somebody, they might interpret that as sarcasm, right? Imagine not talking to the person ahead of time and saying, how would you feel about establishing this type of protocol in our friendship?
Yeah.
And all of a sudden you whip out, you're raising your voice at them with furrowed eyebrows, something else, sorry. And they're going to be like, what?
Exactly.
That'll be a little bit jarring for them.
Totally.
So you should definitely, I like that you mentioned that, Greg, because
you made me think of something else.
Tell them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You made me think of something else, which is really important with apologies in general, in this method, but apologies in general, which is once you make the apology, and I'm totally guilty of this, it's really important to not then dive back into the argument, right? So once you make the apology, stay committed to that apology, right? Like, don't say, I'm sorry, but. The sorry, but essentially brings you right back into the argument, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a big difference between I'm sorry and, which is like, I'm sorry and I want to move forward,
right,
versus I'm sorry, but, which means I'm not really ready to let go of why I'm angry.
Exactly.
Right? So that's, I think, a very important distinction.
That's a good point. And you can address the but part after. Maybe take that to, address that after the cooling off period.
Right.
So maybe a couple hours later or even a day later. But I don't think really beyond that's necessary. Just generally speaking. Of course, everyone's situation is different. But I think, taking the moment to just cool off and then talking about this is what made me upset kind of thing is important to address so that the person or the people involved know what triggered you or got under your skin. Totally. But there's a moment for that.
Yeah,
right?
I almost view that as a separate conversation.
Yeah.
You have the apology conversation, and then separately, whether it's an hour later or a day later, completely independent of the apology, you have a mature conversation about what caused the conflict, what might have catalyzed the confrontation, and how might that be avoided in the future.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's a lot of different ways to sort of, address apologies and to perform them because they are a speech act. And they are important, right? They're important if you care enough about the friendship or the relationship. Again, if you didn't care, then you could just, let it blow over and see what happens, next week.
Well, that's a really good point, right? Apologies are a signal that you really care about the relationship, right? In a relationship that you don't care about, you don't have to apologize because you're planning to not ever engage, right? You're planning to engage less. If you
that's how humans rationalize
right.
it,
You're not committed to it.
Yeah.
By apologizing, you're saying, I'm committed enough to our relationship to say sorry and to show vulnerability and compromise.
Yep.
Because it's more important that we maintain the well-being of this relationship than it is to be right in this moment.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. You were mentioning something that you listened to from Peter Attia.
Right.
And the whole vulnerability thing. Do you want to share that if it's relevant?
Yeah. I mean, there was a really good interview on the podcast that I love. It's a medical podcast called Peter Attia, and he normally deals with very specific medical topics. And longevity-related topics. But he also occasionally brings in one of his pillars of longevity is mental wellness. And he brought in a fantastic psychologist who primarily works with males. But the concept he brought up specifically that I found was really, made a deep impression on me was this, it was actually there was a husband and wife, and the husband often would lose his temper, and he would lose his temper and take it out on the wife. But often it was for situations where he felt dependent, on the wife.
Right.
And so when he felt that dependence, that's when he felt weak.
Right.
And so he was really getting angry at himself.
But projecting
the anger toward his wife.
Toward his wife, yeah.
And by seeing that, he was able to sort of reframe his frustration and anger in a way that allowed him to not be angry at his wife and instead to recognize the situation. But what I liked about
interesting, yeah.
what the psychologist also did, psychiatrist also did, was he put some work for the wife as well, which is when she sees her husband losing his temper, that she should remind him or ask him, are you feeling vulnerable at this moment, right? And that can really disengage the situation because it reminds him why he's angry. It's not really at his wife. It's at a situation that has more to do with his own psychology.
Right. Maybe he was underslept. Maybe he has like a work thing going on. Like in his mind, he's trying to figure out something for work.
Yeah. And so the way I look at that is when we're apologizing, it's not about who is right or wrong, because often the right or wrong doesn't matter.
It doesn't even matter.
Right?
It's irrelevant at
It's
that
irrelevant.
point.
The apology is really just saying, I want to get back to,
Homeostasis.
life, to homeostasis, to equilibrium.
Serenity and harmony.
Let's stop, focusing and allocating our resources to fighting and reallocate them to repair and progress.
Exactly. Yeah, I love that. I think we have a question. Do you want to see if we can read that?
Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, so the question is, people tend to think I lie when I ramble on, right? So the idea that sort of not finishing a statement can or not being coherent with what you're saying maybe is a indication that you're not being honest. Look, I would say that in general, particularly when we're frustrated, it's very difficult to be articulate. Yeah. Right?
We get swept away by our emotions.
And we don't really know what we're trying to say necessarily. Yeah. And so,
because we haven't processed those emotions ourselves, right?
Exactly.
It takes time to figure out. We just know, right? We have this psychosomatic reaction almost that we are angry or upset, we're sad, we take it out. But then we haven't processed that ourselves, nor are we able to articulate that to the other person, right?
Right, totally. And so in that kind of situation, we often do say things that we don't mean and do things that we don't really want to do. Yeah. And it has nothing to do with honesty. It's just purely to do with how we're, the state of our mind in that moment. Yeah. And the sooner you can return your body to equilibrium, the clearer your thoughts become, and the less likely you are to ramble on. Yeah. And I think that's really your goal in these situations. It's to restore your mind to a sense of peace. And an apology is a very good way to sort of embark on that process.
Yeah, and I think in terms of length, because the question is how short or long should an apology be? I think it really depends on the type of, like, what was the frustration about? Right, so sort of to touch upon earlier, if the conflict is something that's going to take a couple of hours, maybe a week to resolve, to really figure out, what to do, then it might need to be a little bit of a longer apology. Whereas if it's like the whole idea behind the fast, simple, sorry method is like for the little squabbles, like, forgot to empty the dishwasher. But that prevented someone from having their coffee, and because they didn't have their coffee, they missed their meeting. I don't know. I'm just coming up with some, examples, right? So looking at the type of conflict that was created from that, and basing that on, or using that to determine how long or elaborate the apology can be. Does that make sense?
It's an interesting question, and my personal view on length is that it doesn't matter. Right, my focus is more on how authentic is it. Yeah. How heartfelt is it? And so a good apology in my mind is one where you demonstrate that you want to do things differently so that the same problem doesn't happen in the future.
Right, like going forward, what are the steps to take so that this thing it's not a rehashing of the same old conflict.
And then the second part of it is showing that you understand what made the other person angry, right, or frustrated or sad. So it's a combination of empathy and then commitment to avoiding that situation in the future. I think those are the ingredients of a good apology. They don't have to be long, right?
Yeah.
You can do that in a concise way, or you can do it in an elaborate way. It's up to you, whatever is most appropriate for the relationship you have.
Yeah.
But it's showing that sincerity, that empathy, that makes for a good apology and an effective apology.
I think that's so true. And I think I would add one ingredient, which is validation. Because when you validate the person's feelings, you're acknowledging that something, so not emptying the dishwasher caused them some frustration in the morning. If that's your task to do, right, in your house, you delegated that role. Maybe, you are able to understand why that person was upset and you're validating how they felt.
Yep.
Right? So that's a big one too, validation, because it shows that compassion that's there.
Absolutely.
So again, right, saying sorry, it's not just saying sorry and being done with. It's all the other work that we're doing with it, right? It's the compassion, it's the empathy, it's the validation, it's the sincerity and the authenticity, and coming up with the protocol. Maybe you have a specific way of running your apologies with the people that you love. So coming up with this kind of thing can really go a long way. So do this, of course, before you get to that moment of being angry and upset, before the tempest, is unleashed. So sit down, have a heart-to-heart, with the people that you love, and say, when we have squabbles, when we have arguments, why don't we try this way of apologizing? Or I've noticed that when we have these conflicts, like this, and this happens, maybe there's a way to short circuit that process and do X, Y, Z. So,
laying the groundwork ahead of time goes a very long way toward facilitating smoother and more effective apologies and conflict resolution in general.
Yeah, and it's good for your interpersonal relationships.
Yep. All right. Well, I think we hit the time.
Yeah. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for participating. We love when we have interactivity.
Yeah.
And for those of you joining us later for the replay, feel free to leave a comment, leave your questions, anything and everything if you want. So that's a wrap.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, guys.
We'll see you next time for your next Explearning lesson and the next live stream. Have a wonderful weekend, a wonderful week.
Yeah.
We'll see you again.
We'll see you soon.
Happy Explearning, everyone.